I'm Connie. I believe everybody knows me. And I just want to welcome everyone this morning to the Scottish American History Forum, and also to wish everybody a very happy Mother's Day weekend, by the way. And as most of you know, the Scottish American History Forum is part of the Arts and Cultural Division of Chicago Scots, formerly the Illinois St. Andrew Society, which founded the oldest 501c3 charity in the state of Illinois, way back in 1845. We're very proud of it. It was later named Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care, and it's located in North Riverside, Illinois. Chicago Scots is dedicated to nurturing Scottish identity through service, fellowship, and celebration of Scottish culture, in addition to support of the Caledonia Senior Living and Memory Care campus. And so for additional information, please check out our website, which is can be found at www.chicagoscots.org. And please give generously to our Caledonia Senior Care charity. It's a one-of-a-kind mission that we can all be proud of. And we do have the group from the living room at Caledonia this morning watching with us today. They're all very anxious to hear Dr. O'Leary. So before we begin our presentation today with question and answer with Brendan O'Leary at the end, we're going to hear from Gus Noble in a minute. But Gus, I've asked Jim Sim first just to talk to us a little bit about the Scottish Festival and Highland Games here in Itasca coming up. And so Jim, tell us about your pipe band competition and all the rest, please.
Well, there's a few of us on the committee that are on this Zoom call, but glad to talk. June 16th and 17th are the Highland Games in Itasca, Illinois, on the site of Hamilton Lakes. I can tell you that we're going to have upwards of over 40 pipe bands appearing. And there'll be the grades 1, 2, and 3 bands all play twice. So there'll be over 60 pipe band performances that day, including the top 2 bands in the United States. The only 2 grade 1 bands in the United States will both be appearing, as well as 7 grade 2 bands. So it will be the largest contest in North America this year, as it was last year. And this year it's going to be probably 25% bigger than it was last year. So we're going to be starting the contest as the sun comes up and finishing it as the sun goes down. The mass band should be fantastic this year with a great performance there. As well as we're bringing in the National Chef of Scotland, Gary McLean, to do cooking demonstrations. We're going to have whiskey tastings, of course, the entertainment tent with some great entertainment, children's area, the heavy athletics. It's going to be quite a day. So we hope everybody can make it.
Wonderful, wonderful, Jim. And the mass bands, I believe last year there were 3,000 pipers and drummers on the field.
That might be stretching it a bit. It was probably closer to 1,000, but that's still huge.
It looked big to me.
Yes, it is pretty impressive. And it'll be even bigger this year.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for all your great work. Jim was our kinsman of the year. He was elected the kinsman for the Chicago area, and we're very proud of him. Anybody else from the committee want to talk about the festival before we call upon our president, Gus, to welcome everyone? Any other festival announcements? Okay, well, Gus, we're delighted to have you, and so pleased that you always make time for us. And I would like to call upon you to greet everyone and to give us some updates on Caledonia and Chicago Scots. And of course, for any newcomers on the phone, Gus Noble is our president and has led our community for many years. We're so fortunate to have him. Gus, good morning.
Good morning, Connie. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm in a place where I'm dropping off the kids for some fun. So I'm shuffling both boys at once. So I apologize for any background noise, but it's a wonderful thing that you do, Connie, to put everything together. And mentioning Jim as our kinsman, you were a kinswoman, and I'm so grateful to you for all that you do for our Scottish community. And these history forum sessions are just wonderful, wonderful ways to spend some time and get together with everyone. I want to welcome everyone, and especially Dr. O'Leary. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. I also want to say hello to all the folks at Caledonia Senior Living who are tuning in, and to my pal Caroline, who I see on the line too. So I'll just keep it there, and thank Dr. O'Leary for his time this morning.
Okay, lovely. Well, thank you. Well, I just have one additional announcement before we move forward. I just want to remind everyone that next month on June 10th, Bill Caudle, who is the director of the Scottish Heritage Center at St. Andrews University in Laurenburg, North Carolina, and also a university instructor of music there, is going to be with us to talk to us about the history of the Highland settlement of the Upper Cape Fear and Upper PD regions of the Carolinas. And Bill, by the way, Jim, I'm hoping you could be on, because Bill is going to be here this summer in Itasca competing at our Illinois Scottish Festival and Highland Games Pipes and Drums Band competition. And he does lead the St. Andrews Pipe Band down in the Laurenburg area in Scotland County, North Carolina. So you won't want to miss next month. Okay, so now I do believe it's time to move forward today. And we are so very pleased to have with us a truly world-renowned professor, Brendan O'Leary, who is the Lauder Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, Fulbright Scholar to Ireland, NUI-Galway, and Honorary Professor of Political Science at Queen's University in Belfast. And so, Dr. O'Leary, we're so anxious to hear you speak on your topic today, Irish Futures, Ireland and Northern Ireland. So welcome, and I believe Jack and I are ready to turn the program over to you now.
Thank you very much, Connie. I'm going to share my screen, first of all, and let's check that I've done that successfully before we do anything else.
Good.
Is that good? Can you see me?
Perfect, yes.
See the slides? Excellent.
Wonderful.
First of all, thank you, Connie, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to interact with you all. Every summer, I go to the village of Cushendall on the North Antrim coast, and at around 4 a.m. in the morning, the sun comes blasting through, and I can see the Mull of Kintyre, which is a mere 12 miles away. So the part of Ireland in which I went to high school is very close to Scotland. So I do have some Scottish connections, and every summer I usually go on boat trips to various parts of Scotland. And I will not tell you my average whiskey consumption on those occasions. We're going to deal with a much more sober topic this morning, namely Irish futures. The past is not going to be my subject. I have written on this. Forgive me for advertising 3 lengthy volumes, and you'll be very pleased to know I'm not going to go through them in any detail at all. But I do want to emphasize that 25 years ago, on April the 10th, the Good Friday Agreement was made. It was made in Northern Ireland. It was made between Ireland and the Republic, between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And it was made with the agreement of the Westminster and UK Parliament. It was supported by the European Union, and very importantly, it was supported by the then US administration. This fundamental agreement is in trouble. At the moment, the institutions in Northern Ireland, particularly the Assembly, are boycotted by the Democratic Unionist Party, the more hardline of the 2 major unionist parties in the north. It's worth remembering that 25 years ago, in a few weeks' time, in less than a week's time, on May the 22nd, the people in both parts of Ireland endorsed the Good Friday Agreement in referendums held in the North and South, respectively. The North voted 71% in favour of the agreement. The Republic voted 94% in favour of the agreement. In doing so, they were endorsing the idea of the late John Hume, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Hume's argument was that what was agreed was what was necessary, was an agreed Ireland in which both parts of Ireland would endorse a settlement, not a final settlement, but a settlement that would contain key principles. And that settlement has had an extraordinary impact in generating long-run peace. It has not had such a successful run in terms of the running of its institutions. You may be aware that last week some people have suggested that our President Joseph Biden, made a gaffe. He said in remarks to the Democratic National Committee that he had to go back to Ireland recently in order to ensure that the Brits didn't screw around in Northern Ireland and didn't walk away from their commitments. That's been described as a gaffe. I think it's a fairly accurate description of what President Biden has been doing since he arrived in office. Namely, he has sought to prevent, particularly the Conservative Party in the UK, from resigning from commitments that it made to the European Union in order to preserve the gains of the Good Friday Agreement. And what those were, I will mention in passing later on, but I want to move quickly to the future and the premise of my argument. I'm going to suggest that we're living in the twilight of the union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I might be wrong about that, but the great thing about talking about the future is you can't immediately be proven wrong. So bear with me and accept that premise. But it's also my premise that transformation from the current state of the union into the possibility of a united Ireland would be premature and not feasible under the current provisions of the Good Friday Agreement, which require there to be referendums in both parts of Ireland to endorse the possibility of a united Ireland. And at the moment, there is no such level of support inside Northern Ireland. The provisions relating to future referendums is a subject on which I've worked with others. We published a final report on May 2021. And if you go online, you can get a copy of that report if you want to read all the intricate details. It is sometimes said that the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement are ambiguous. I disagree vigorously with that. What is true is that they are incomplete. They don't cover every possibility and every scenario. Before any referendums would take place, and in my judgment, to cut to the chase, such referendums are unlikely before 2030. A key set of preparatory choices would have to be made by the Government of Ireland. One of them is fairly obvious. It has to decide whether it wants a matching referendum in the Republic to that in the North to take place at the same time as the one in the North, which would, in a very visible sense, express joint Irish self-determination. Or in the alternative, do they want to have sequenced referendums in which the North votes first? Because if the South is going to contemplate any significant constitutional amendments, it seems strange to put the Republic through those changes unless it knows that the North is going to join it. So that's the first choice, having simultaneous or sequenced referendums. The second choice is whether the South should propose a distinct model of unification in advance of the referendums, or in the alternative, should it propose a process to pick a model after the referendums vote in favour of a united Ireland. In the first scenario, it would be clear what it would be the obligation of the Government of Ireland to make clear what would happen in the event of a referendum vote in favour of unification. In the second, it would be a commitment to hold a constitutional convention in new circumstances, with that convention presumably being constrained by a set of criteria to make a new Ireland on the basis of principles that had been endorsed in the course of the referendum campaigns. If we look ahead over the next decade, it's easy to think of 4 scenarios. I'm not going to go through them all in any detail because I'm quickly going to eliminate 2 of them. But the 4 scenarios are generated as a result of thinking about 2 sets of institutional possibilities. In one set of possibilities, the Northern Ireland Assembly and the bodies established by the Good Friday Agreement will function. The Northern Ireland Assembly, elected by proportional representation, elects in principle a power-sharing executive. Under the Good Friday Agreement, there's a set of North-South ministerial council meetings to cooperate on matters affecting the whole island. And separately, there's a British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference addressing relations between Great Britain and Ireland. In addition, a British-Irish Council in which the devolved governments of the UK, including Scotland, Wales, as well as Northern Ireland, the Channel Islands, all interact with the Irish government. That's one possibility, that those institutions all function. The other possibility is, as at present, that they don't function. Then the second question is whether the new protocol agreed between the European Union and the United Kingdom to address the difficulties arising from the UK's decision to leave the European Union, whether that protocol will hold. That protocol has recently been redressed in new clothes, called the Windsor Agreement, which did modify some textual elements of the original protocol, but broadly speaking, it's the same content. And that content can be briefly explained as follows. As a result of the UK's decision to leave the European Union, Northern Ireland is to remain, unlike Great Britain, inside the European single market for goods and agriculture. And the customs posts and customs barriers between the United Kingdom and the European Union are to be administered at ports and airports between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the so-called sea border. These unusual arrangements mean that the Union now has 2 separate sets of trading arrangements, those that affect Great Britain and those that affect Northern Ireland. This is a compromise designed to reflect the fact that Northern Ireland had a distinct majority in favour of remaining in the European Union. So did Scotland, but Scottish wishes and preferences were by and large utterly ignored by the Conservative government. So there are 2 possibilities. Either this protocol, modified by the Windsor Agreement, functions, or it doesn't. And that sets up 4 possibilities. But I'm immediately going to exclude the 2 at the bottom, in which the protocol doesn't function. And the reason I'm saying that is I'm very confident that as a result of these tweaks and changes, and the remote likelihood of another hardline Brexit government inside the Westminster Parliament, I think for the decade ahead, we can presume either Conservatives led by Rishi Sunak, which I think is the lower probability, and then a higher probability, a new British government led by the Labour leader, Keir Starmer. Under all of those scenarios, I think there will be a commitment by the European Union and the UK to make the protocol work. So that leaves us with 2 scenarios. The institutions work and the institutions don't work. If they do work, I think that will set us on a glide path towards reunification in ways that I will examine in a moment. If they don't work, I think that creates a more troublesome scenario. And what will happen is that some unionists will prefer the restoration of direct rule over Northern Ireland. And the Irish government and Irish nationalists in Northern Ireland will insist on the letter of the agreement. And according to the agreement, the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference addresses all matters of public policy affecting Northern Ireland that are not devolved. And the Irish push will be for Ireland to be consulted on all matters affecting direct rule, should that occur. So those are the two futures that I think are most plausible over the rest of this decade. What is, in my view, driving change? Three things. First of all, demography, which I'll go through in some depth. Secondly, slow electoral change, which I'll also illustrate with maps. And lastly, and not least, the train wreck that is Brexit. So have a look at the graphic in front of you. It shows the distribution of population in Northern Ireland by religion, identified religion in the census, since 1861 right up until the present. And you'll notice that the blue line on top, which represents Protestants and other Christians, peaked in the period of World War II, between 1937 and 1951, and has been declining ever since. By contrast, the Catholic population in the green line fell consistently as a proportion of Northern Ireland's population until 1961. There's a further fall in 71 and 81 where there were partial boycotts of the census by cultural Catholics. And since then, that population has been on a significant climb. And in the most recent census, for the first time in Northern Ireland's history, Catholics outnumbered Protestants. Now, since 2001, the mode of classification of self in referendums has changed. People who don't identify with any religion are asked a question to identify their family religion, so to speak, the religion in which they were brought up. So you should not interpret the data, especially from 2001 onwards, as indicating distinct religious belief. A few other things to notice about the slide in front of you. First of all, the red line is those who didn't state their religion. And you can see that number has now disappeared. That's no longer a census option because people are asked to identify their community of origin, and by and large, they do so. The yellow line are those like myself who have no religion and don't identify with the religion, though I am, for your information, a cultural Catholic by background. And the last is other religions and philosophies. Northern Ireland has a very small population of those belonging to other religions from recent immigrant communities. If we look at absolute numbers in the census, as opposed to the proportions identified through time, the picture is even more striking. You can see that the Catholic numbers have been growing significantly and are likely to continue to do so. The story about Northern Ireland used to be a story of 1 million Protestants don't want to go into United Ireland. Well, now it would be more accurately told as a story of 750,000 Protestants, as opposed to 1 million. The none or not stated category since 1991, that's the fastest growing category, slightly faster than Catholics. It's difficult to tell which population is becoming a set of unbelievers at the faster pace. I think it's fairly even. I don't think you should assume that most of those are Protestants. I think there's a balance among both communities in terms of transfer to that category. You'll notice that Presbyterians, who were usually of Scots origin, you can take it as a rough guide that if somebody's of Presbyterian origin, they're more likely to be a descendant of Scottish settlers who came to Ulster in the 17th century. Those who belong to the Church of Ireland, Anglicans, are more likely to have had English or Welsh heritage. Church of Ireland numbers peaked in 1951. They're now at just over a quarter of overall Catholic numbers. Presbyterians are now roughly 40% of Catholic numbers. So that's a transformed picture. And the assumption made by many is that religion affects political preference in Northern Ireland. That's undoubtedly true, but it isn't an absolute. It's not absolutely clear for everybody that that is the case, and I'll qualify that assumption in a moment. The third category of people, those who are neither Protestant nor Catholic, but identify with other religions, we might want to probe the census data looking at ethnicity. In the UK census, at least as regards Northern Ireland, this is a very confusing category which conflates some notion of race with being from outside of Europe. And you'll see the categories in front of you. 96.55% of the population of the North are white. Then there's a whole range of smaller categories running from Irish travellers, the Roma, who do not like being called gypsies, the Roma, their ethnic cousins, and then a series of largely Asian and South Indian categories. These minority populations will, if they have citizenship, be potentially pivotal in a close run referendum. And it's a good question to ask in what direction they might vote in the event of referendums on unification. This is the graphic I'd like you to pay some attention to. It's from the 2011 census. That's from over 10 years ago. I'm giving you this particular graphic because the age cohort data from the recent census have not yet been published. Now, my assumption is, illustrated by the Grim Reaper on the right, is that the Grim Reaper comes for those of us who are over 65 at an increased pace compared to those of us below 65. And I've just become 65, so I'm pretty conscious of this category. What the graphic shows is the net Catholic demographic lead in each age cohort in the 2011 census. And you can see that up until 2011, cultural Catholics were ahead in every category up until the 65 to 70 category. Now remember, in 2031, it'll be 20 years later, so that all of the net Protestant lead in the categories from 70 onwards will almost certainly have been completely extinguished. And there will be a cultural Catholic majority in the electorate as well as demographically. Now, that doesn't mean there will automatically be a united Ireland. What it does mean is that the fate of Northern Ireland in any future referendums will now be entirely in the hands of cultural Catholics. I use that category to refer both to believers and those who are from Catholic families by origin. Now, I'm not saying that it would be a good thing that matters were entirely in the hands of the cultural Catholic population, but I think it would be fair to say that that will be a demographic and electoral fact, and transformative, given that Northern Ireland was created in the first place with a deliberate majority of 2-to-1 of Protestants over Catholics, with the intent on the part of the then Unionists of keeping Northern Ireland in the Union forever. So, important caveats about this level of demographic change. Obviously, where you're born, what pram you're brought up in, does not determine your electoral destiny. But it is very true that there are more Catholic Unionists at the moment than there are Protestants willing to contemplate a united Ireland. The growth in the others is important, and some think of them as a completely third category. I think on most questions, when posed, they split into traditional camps, typically reflecting the families that they came from. Whoever wins political support among the new minorities will be doing themselves a favor. And by and large here, loyalist working class communities, especially where paramilitaries have been prevalent, have been displaying overt acts of racism which make them unlikely to win the support of the new minorities. So what we can say with confidence is that a less Protestant, more undecided, and more fluid electorate will decide in the decade ahead. What is fascinating is that in surveys that I asked with my colleague John Gary, that were PUCA surveys, we found an extraordinary 17% of the population, mostly cultural Catholics, didn't know in response to the question, if there were a referendum on the subject of United Ireland, would you vote in favour or not? That don't know category is available for political persuasion. What makes them more likely to be persuaded, in my view, is the way in which Conservatives have run the Union since 2010, culminating, of course, in leaving the European Union. And what makes that a fixed constant for the time being is that the Labour Party is committed, if it wins the next general election in the UK or heads a minority government, it is committed to staying out of the European Union, and remarkably is also saying that it will not rejoin the single market or the customs union. It's important to note also, and I'm going to come back to this point, that it's not clear that the population in Northern Ireland realised the startling extent to which the Republic of Ireland is a dramatic economic success story, something I'm going to confirm for you in a moment. So, point 2, electoral change. This is a map of the 18 constituencies in Northern Ireland that send a member of Parliament to the Westminster Parliament. If the colours are green, they're nationalist. If the colours are orange or deep orange, they're held by unionists, and other colours are used for other categories. I'm using these constituencies because they're the winner-takes-all electoral system used in backward democracies like the United States, the United Kingdom, India, and Canada. Wise countries use systems of proportional representation. That's a normative bias I have, which I can defend under questioning. Look at this map in 1997. You can see that the map looks mostly unionist. They took 13 of the 18 seats, and nationalists had 1 seat in Belfast. By 2001, in the map on the left, the seats in the south and the west had all greened, and the balance was now 11 unionists to 7 nationalists. By 2010, there was a near balancing of the blocks with the Alliance Party, which is an other party which does not identify as either nationalist or unionist, held a seat in Belfast. And for the first time, unionists lost an overall majority inside Belfast. So that was a significant shift. Unionists held 9 seats, nationalists 8, and the others 1. By 2019, the Boris Johnson electoral victory in Great Britain masked the transformation of Northern Ireland. In these elections, the Unionists lost for the first time a majority in seats at the Westminster Parliament. Nationalists took 9 seats and the others took 1. Now, what's stunning about this result is look at Belfast. Belfast was a city built by Presbyterians. It has 3 nationalist MPs and 1 unionist MP. That's a bit like the PLO winning elections in Tel Aviv. It's a truly historic transformation. So that's the broad picture of electoral change, which is partly underpinned by the demographic change that I was describing earlier. The third driver of change, of course, is Brexit, which I regard unapologetically as a train wreck. It's a train wreck because it's profoundly damaged the UK's economic trading relationships, its regulatory picture, and its interaction with its allies, particularly the European Union and the United States. And the consequence has been very clear for Northern Ireland. It's triggered a lot of turbulence. And I think the long run consequence will be to detach a significant number of liberal Protestant unionists from identification with the union, and it will have the same effect among middle class cultural Catholics. If I'm right, and it's a conditional, if I'm right in suggesting that these are the prospects of change, what's the appropriate strategy to be adopted by those who favor unification? I believe that the appropriate strategy is to seek losers' consent and to avoid what I will call the valley of transition. Let me explain what I mean. In order for future referendums to occur smoothly, an enormous amount of work will have to be done by the Government of Ireland. But I'm just going to focus on the question of achieving losers' consent. That's a very, very important political objective because it's good in a democracy if the losing side accepts the results. We're all aware of that in the United States. President Trump did not accept that he'd lost, and we still live with the negative repercussions of that refusal to accept loss. Those who seek to win reunification know that strategically and ethically it will be best if they maximize losers' consent. And that requires agreement on a fair and transparent process, and it requires thinking very carefully about what accommodations will most successfully achieve the consent of the unionist population. At the same time, those who are pursuing unification need to consider their base. If they make too many future conditional promises to British Protestants entering a united Ireland, they might lose their base. So they have to be addressed. And so too have the don't knows and the undecideds. Imagine those engaged in such strategic thought do the necessary planning. What should they do? They need to elaborate different models of Irish unification. They need to check with public opinion on which model is most likely to be successful in maximizing losers' consent, in achieving the support of those who back the idea of unification, and winning over the undecided. And that model would eventually have to be presented in clear ways through publication in book form, media form, videos, popular formats, and so on, as the version of unification that will be on offer when the Northern referendum is called. So that's what I think a sensible strategy would look like. And what would it mean? Well, basically, at the moment, given the constitutional arrangements inside Ireland and Northern Ireland, there are only two feasible models of unification that could be on offer, absent significant constitutional change in the Republic. In one, a united Ireland would be an integrated Ireland. There would be no continuing Northern Ireland as a political unit. Decisions would be made by an all-island parliament and government in Dublin. There would, of course, be local government arrangements, but Northern Ireland per se would be dissolved. The other option is to preserve a devolved Northern Ireland inside a united Ireland. That possibility was enabled a long time ago, both by Michael Collins and by Eamon de Valera in the making of the Irish Free State, and subsequently in the making of Bunreacht na Éireann, the current constitution of Ireland. So taking these possible models into consideration, what's the best way of achieving losers' consent? The first table I present to you, and it's a little tricky, focuses on those who are least likely to accept a united Ireland. And here I'm focusing on roughly 1/3 of Northern Protestants who answered the relevant question with the statement that they would find Irish unification almost impossible to accept. And where you see a tick here, it indicates that this makes the idea of Irish unification more positive in their minds. And where you see an X, you can conclude that this makes them more negative. As we go down the table, the impact of the relevant measure reduces in intensity. And likewise, as we go down the table with the X's, so Protestant antipathy to United Ireland increases. So for Northern Protestants, retaining their British citizenship and retaining the right to be British citizens only makes accepting unification much more palatable, very strongly so. Likewise, but to a lesser extent, keeping the socialized medicine model of the United Kingdom, the National Health Service, and likewise having secular education. As we go down the table, a series of other measures that might be expected to make unionists think more warmly about Irish unification achieve less impact on this category of person. Having a unionist veto in the Dublin Parliament, being better off economically, having unionists in government, Ireland rejoining the Commonwealth, provision to protect Ulster Scots, a new flag for a united Ireland, denominational education, that's a difference in opinion with those who favor secular education. That's the things that, broadly speaking, might make a difference to their attitude towards a united Ireland, a positive difference. If we look at negative things, having a new anthem makes no difference, and in fact is opposed by some. Rejoining the European Union is opposed. Fear of violence, rationally, is undesirable. They don't like, strongly, the Irish health system, though arguably they're ill-informed about it. If they would be made worse off economically, that's a rational response to the possibility of a united Ireland. And you'll see that they very clearly, of the two unpalatable choices, they prefer a devolved Northern Ireland to an integrated model of unification. Now, let's add to that table, to make life even more complicated for you, those who support unification in the third and fourth columns with the green headings. Look first at the far right column, where we have those in the Republic of Ireland who are pro-unification. And I've pointed out with little red bars the topics that affect the base, those who support Irish unification. They don't like the idea that unionists could remain British citizens only. They're quite happy for them to be British citizens and Irish citizens, but they don't like the idea of British citizenship only. They're very strongly opposed to a unionist veto in a Dublin Parliament. They're strongly opposed to Irish rejoining the Commonwealth. They're opposed to a new flag. They're opposed to a new anthem. And quite rationally as well, they're opposed to unification if it makes them worse off economically. Note also at the end that pro-unification Southerners prefer the integrated model of a united Ireland to a devolved united Ireland. Now let's add in the undecideds, particularly those in the Republic of Ireland. Now, what's interesting, to cut a long story short, is that those who are undecided or who don't know in the Republic of Ireland are very, very similar to those who support unification. So the same kind of topics that give rise to concern about unification among those who support it are the topics that would be of concern to the undecided. So that simplifies thinking about long-run strategy. So given that picture that I've very quickly tried to portray to you, the question becomes, what model of Irish unification would minimize unionist discontent without alienating supporters of unification or undecided voters? And here's the story. We can separate the subject matter into three domains: questions of political and constitutional design, social policies, and cultural accommodations. So a devolved Northern Ireland rather than an integrated Ireland is much preferred by hardline unionists, and it's still preferred by those who support unification, though they would really prefer an integrated Ireland. Having unionists in the government through institutional arrangements, but without a veto power, produces a sufficiently positive reaction from the three categories that we're focused on, namely the undecideds, those who support unification strongly, and those who find unification almost impossible to accept. For that reason, it makes sense to allow unionists, even though it may be arguably against their interests, to insist on keeping their British citizenship only and not availing of Irish citizenship. There are some costs to that, because under the Irish Constitution, only citizens get to vote in constitutional referendums or in elections to the presidency. All British citizens resident in Ireland have the right to vote in parliamentary elections and in local government elections. So it would differentially affect them. Clearly, some model of socialized medicine is more likely to be successful with the electorate north and south. Likewise, a secular education system, north and south, has quite strong support, remarkable evidence of a thoroughgoing secularization across both sides of the border. Protections for Ulster Scots have a sufficiently positive level of support from most groups. Now, all of these questions, of course, would have to be researched further, but it does suggest that there's a potentially reasonable model of what a united Ireland might look like if it were to try and maximize the likelihood of achieving losers' consent. It's worth pointing out that there's no payoff for those who support Irish unification in upsetting their flag on the, upsetting their base on the question of the flag or the anthem, because at least for the moment, that makes no difference, no significant difference to the opinions of Protestants. The matter of the Commonwealth, in my view, is probably more available for bargaining. If both sides were to get their most preferred international organization, the EU on the part of nationalists, the Commonwealth on the part of unionists, that I think could be a meeting point for compromise. And I'm happy to take further questions on that. Unionists, of course, are going to strategize too. And we know what their strategy is. They've already told us that they will refuse to engage on the details of a united Ireland until they've lost the Northern referendum. After all, their position will be, why help the enemy? So that creates a dilemma for those who favor unification. How do you accommodate people who, obviously for their own sensible reasons, don't want to help you win? How do you provide as soft a landing as possible? So one of the things that really matters is whether unionists will keep their preference for a devolved Ireland over an integrated Ireland. And what my colleague John Gary and I have managed to show in deliberative fora is that if people are given objective information about the Republic and about the possibility of continuing a devolved government, their opinions change in engagement and discussion of the subject. Broadly speaking, what happens is unionists decide that given that devolved government hasn't been working well inside Northern Ireland at the moment, why would it work better inside the Republic of Ireland? That's a question that occurs to them and shifts their opinion. Not everybody's opinion, but a significant amount. The other question we ask people is, what's their view on specifying a model of unification before the referendums, rather than, for example, constructing a new Ireland after a constitutional convention? And here the data is remarkable. Each of the 5 categories I've been talking about, those Northern Protestants who find unification impossible to accept, those Northern Irish Catholics who favor unification, those in the Republic who favor unification, and the undecideds, all of them want the model of unification to be specified in the referendum beforehand. Why? Because they're all burnt by Brexit. They voted on Brexit without it being clear what leave meant. And that, I think, has had long-run consequences for political culture in both parts of Ireland. The idea that you could postpone the constitutional and institutional details of a united Ireland and simply vote on the principle and have a constitutional convention afterwards is a recipe for actually losing the referendums. So that implies, in my view, that the appropriate strategy has to be to support a devolved Northern Ireland, at least transitionally, and that the appropriate strategy would be one of model building before the referendums, long before the referendums. So that's strategic question number one, what to do about accomplishing maximum levels of losers' consent. The second question is what to do about those in the north who are undecided. And you might, in fact, consider this a puzzle. Why aren't there more Northern Ireland cultural Catholics who support unification? I believe there are three answers, each of which may be partially correct. First of all, there are Northern Ireland cultural Catholic unionists. They simply prefer the UK to the Republic of Ireland. Then there are those who arguably may lack requisite information about the performance of the Republic. And lastly, there are those who fear the costs of transition. Now, these could be overlapping categories. I'm going to focus on the latter two, but it's worth giving polite messages to those who are, so to speak, Catholic unionists. The current performance of the British economy and its expected performance is particularly dire in relationship to previous projections. The performance of the UK looks as if it's taken a permanent 5% hit in terms of gross domestic product. Britain's productivity has been lowered, and it's very difficult to see how it's going to be raised this side of re-entry into the European single market. Britain's tax burden is very, very extensive. It's now the highest level since World War II. And that's not because it's had socialist government. It's had conservative governments, broadly speaking, since 2010. So, you know, if you're a unionist, you really do need to think about the comparative performance of the UK economy, because that shapes Northern Ireland's welfare. If you're a conservative with a capital C, then you should stay with the union rationally, because the evidence is since 1951 that gives you a higher likelihood of having a party in government that you appreciate. But if your political preference is not for the Conservative Party, and that's true of most Northern Ireland cultural Catholics, then it's irrational to support remaining in the union. You have a roughly 1 in 4 chance of a non-conservative government. What about those who have a lack of information about the South? It's really quite simple to believe that this is possible, because there are two separate media environments, North and South. The BBC doesn't compare Northern Ireland's performance with the Republic of Ireland. It compares it with Scotland and with Wales, if it compares at all inside the UK. Irish media, which do reach the North, are focused on the negative, like the media everywhere. So if you were simply paying attention to RTE radio, you might not hear accurate or optimistic assessments of the Republic of Ireland's performance. And then lastly, we have the paradox that the leading party of Irish nationalism in the South is Sinn Féin. And it's in opposition, and it criticizes, as opposition parties always do, the performance of the current government. So it's possible to imagine that there's a media environment which prevents Northerners from seeing just how successful the Republic has become. And let me try and take you through that in a little bit further detail. According to the survey data that we carried out, there is remarkably little cross-border communication. Partition has had long-run consequences. People don't travel north and south. They don't communicate north and south. They don't have significant numbers of friends north and south. And there may be an historical recollection problem. The Republic of Ireland fared very badly at the end of what was called its Celtic Tiger phase. So there might be a problem of fear and anxiety about the Republic of Ireland's economic model and its performance. But let me put these in to rest for you. This is a remarkable graphic. In one sense, it's absurd. It measures the economic performance of Ireland and the United Kingdom from 1000 AD, from the Norman conquest. I'm not going to stand by any interpretation of the numbers from 1000 to about 1609, the formation of the settler population of the United States. But look at the period since then. You'll see that Ireland has been a stunning success story in gross domestic product. It's now ahead of both the United States and the United Kingdom per capita. Now, these figures may reasonably be questioned because a lot of what counts as GDP in Ireland is the tax proceedings and activities of international companies, including United States companies. But before you go into that kind of skepticism, just let me call your attention to some immediate, recent and astonishing numbers. Ireland's growth last year was 12.2% compared to 3.5% in the Eurozone as a whole. Only the three big countries of Germany, France, and Italy contributed more than Ireland to Eurozone GDP growth. And in fact, without Ireland's growth performance, Europe would have been in recession territory. So are these figures too good to be true? Paul Krugman of the New York Times referred to Irish official data as leprechaun economics. Now, Mr. Krugman, I regard that statement as bordering on racist, but I won't rest my argument on replying to abuse with further abuse. Instead, I ask you to consider the following. This is gross national income per capita, as opposed to gross domestic product per capita. If you look at this, Ireland is 5th in the world rankings, ahead of the US, and the UK is way back in 22nd place. If we look at gross national income, stripping out the international sector, you can see in the lower line, the orange line, modified gross national income, that the Republic of Ireland's performance over time has been extraordinarily good. And it is true that the impact of international companies has been to exaggerate, so to speak, the impact of Ireland's GDP growth on the local economy. But do recall that the corporate taxes that are paid in Ireland contribute to government, to the government budget. So this is not hallucination. This is not an illusion. The Republic of Ireland is genuinely richer in multiple respects than the United Kingdom. If we take a series of other indexes, non-economic indexes, for example, the Global Happiness Index, Ireland is performing ahead of both the US and the UK, and Ireland's debt to GDP is remarkably low by comparison with both the US and the UK. If we look at Irish household debt or Irish government debt, the position of Ireland is astonishingly better than that of the United Kingdom. So these, I think, are not, broadly speaking, fictional stories. Ireland has been extraordinarily successful economically. By comparison, the UK is still going through the consequences of Brexit, and this visualization suggests that the UK has had a very significant recent shortfall in expected GDP growth, even allowing for the consequences of the global pandemic, which hit everybody. Ireland faces over the next decade the extraordinary story of a positive budget surplus of extraordinary scale. Ireland may well have up to 65 billion euros available as a budgetary surplus by 2026. It could, in my view, use a portion of this to create a sovereign wealth fund to deal with the potential costs of transition. Let's address that transition as my last topic. Could the population in the north be fearful of United Ireland because they fear the cost of transition? Is their mentality one of let's hang on to nurse at Westminster for fear of something worse, that crazy, young, exuberant doctor in the Republic of Ireland. They could be worried that the North might face shock therapy after unification, as East Germany did after German unification. Many Northern Ireland cultural Catholics are employed in the public sector in Northern Ireland. Maybe they fear job losses. Those are economic fears, and they're not irrational. And they're accompanied by political and security fears. People know that the history of Northern Ireland is that, and the history of Ulster, is that when it looks like Irish nationalists are going to be successful, that's when loyalists are at their most violent. So there is, so to speak, what I call a fear of the valley of transition. So let me model this for you in a way that you may or may not find persuasive, and I welcome your comments. On the left-hand axis, I have the perceived welfare of Northern Ireland cultural Catholics, or if you like, the average citizen of Northern Ireland. And I put two curves on the graphic over time. Imagine there's going to be no recessions, imagine there's going to be no fundamental difficulties, but that the Republic of Ireland is going to continually outperform the UK because of its membership of the single market, which makes it very attractive to foreign and direct investors, particularly from the United States. Even in those circumstances, where clearly shifting from the lower curve to the higher curve is better for the average person in Northern Ireland, they might be fearful of making the shift if they believed they faced what I call a valley of transition, a necessary fall before going up to the higher growth path. You could make this thinking more sophisticated by distinguishing between those voters who vote just for themselves, what's in it for me, and those who think sociotropically, what's better for society. And even if you did that, I think the same question would still arise. So what could be done if this is the real model in the mind of many people in Northern Ireland? I happen to believe that to be the case. I haven't yet proven it. I will try and do that in the next few months. In that case, the strategy for those who favor unification is to persuade the base that the descent into the valley will be short, or that there will be no descent. And how might you do that? Well, not only do you have to prepare the South for the possibility of unification in a way that will achieve losers' consent, you have to be prepared to put a sovereign wealth fund aside to deal with perceived and potential actual transitional costs towards a united Ireland. And then there has to be a shift of strategy by those parties that favor Irish reunification. They must think carefully when they criticize the performance of the Southern government, whether when they do so, they're undermining their base inside Northern Ireland by telling them that the Republic is not a well-functioning democracy, which in my judgment, it is. Are there economic clouds on the horizon? Yes, there are tax reforms taking place throughout the world, partly led through American pressure. There is a plan to reduce the minimum corporate tax rate to 15% for large companies, and Ireland has pledged to go along with that. So over the long run, its revenues will fall. Nevertheless, Ireland has had internationally agreed a tax rate of 12.5% for smaller companies. There will be eventually a fall in the corporate tax revenues that are generated particularly from intellectual property rights. But I don't think this is going to be catastrophic, provided the Irish government prepares in advance and provided it doesn't blow its current budgetary windfalls. It's in a very good position to be ready for unification roughly early in 2030. That's where I'll conclude, and I look forward to being interrogated with full respect for the US Bill of Rights. You don't have to agree with a single thing I said. I look forward to being questioned in any direction. Thank you for listening to me.
Well, I will start by saying, wow, Dr. O'Leary, that was not only excellent work that you've offered this morning, but very convincing and inspiration evoking. And I will have a couple of questions for you, but I'd like to open the floor, please. Don't be shy. This is our opportunity to have some very value-added exchange with Dr. O'Leary on this subject. So please jump in. And Jack, maybe you can help turn the microphones back on and the cameras, please. Well, while we're waiting for that to happen, Dr. O'Leary, I'd like to ask you a question. So would you say the devolution option, if enacted, would be similar to the current arrangement with Scotland as part of the UK now? And I may be misunderstanding that, but if so, would you view a post-devolution unification phase as one where debate for an eventual integrated Ireland would continue and be pursued?
The short answer is yes, with this qualification. Given the international commitments in the Good Friday Agreement, the appropriate model for devolution inside the United Ireland would be one that strongly resembled the existing Northern Ireland model rather than the existing Scottish model. And that would mean the maintenance of institutionalized power sharing, but in a different environment in which unionists would now be a minority inside the United Ireland rather than the previous position where they were the historic majority. It would be, of course, the case that you could not, in any sovereign country, you can't absolutely entrench a set of institutional arrangements. There have to be constitutional amendment processes. There has to be the ability to modify things. And one of the pieces of evidence that my friend John Gary and I believe we have shown is that British and Protestant opinion in Northern Ireland is more malleable on the idea of preserving a devolved Northern Ireland than it appears to be on the surface. So it would be a mistake strongly to entrench devolution. But you could decide to start a United Ireland with a devolved Northern Ireland, and you could decide to put a time horizon on that set of institutional arrangements and give people the opportunity to shift from them, say 10, 15 years down the road. There would have to be a mechanism for accomplishing local consent to such changes. Why might people not like a devolved Northern Ireland? First of all, it would make visible any direct degree of subsidy from the Republic to Northern Ireland, which could lead to conflict. In an integrated Ireland, anything that is being redistributed from the epicenter of wealth, which is broadly speaking the Dublin area and the Cork area, that would go to all parts of the island automatically in infrastructural spending, spending on health, spending on education and welfare, without visibly showing a fiscal transfer, so to speak, from the rich part of the country to the poorer part of the country. So that's one reason why you might not want to engage in the experiment. A more important reason is you're all Scots here of one kind or another, and you probably are all familiar with the West Lothian question. And the West Lothian question was the question, why should an MP from West Lothian in Scotland get to vote on matters that are devolved to Scotland when those subjects are being addressed by the Westminster Parliament for England? Now, if you think that's a problem under the existing arrangements in Scotland, the problem would be even bigger in the event of a united Ireland, because Northern Ireland's share of Ireland would be much bigger than Scotland's share of the Westminster Parliament. So there would be institutional difficulties in running the settlement. Roughly speaking, Northern Ireland would be entitled to 38% of the Dublin Parliament. And that might mean dividing Parliament in two for separate votes. So in other words, to cut a long story short, the stability of devolutionary arrangements inside a United Ireland can't be guaranteed. I see a question from John Cameron.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Two quick questions. One was, you mentioned protection for Ulster Scots, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what that means specifically. And secondly, I'm intrigued by the concerns about the health systems and the difference between the two. What is that the Irish health system does not provide compared to the National Health Service in Northern Ireland?
Thank you, John. Both very good questions. As a result of the Good Friday Agreement, though with a very long delay, an Irish Language Act has been passed for Northern Ireland, and there's also provision in that act for Ulster Scots. There is a big difference between the two languages. Irish has a widely recognized dictionary level vocabulary. Ulster Scots does not. Its vocabulary is much shorter. Agreement on script, orthography, and everything else is much more difficult in Ulster Scots. The number of speakers is smaller. The demand to have it as a medium of education is very small by comparison to the demand to have Irish as a potential medium of education. So arguably, the measures of protection and support for Ulster Scots at the moment don't reach the same level of demand as Irish. Nevertheless, in a United Ireland, very great care needs to be taken about having a very large, culturally different minority. And the current Irish Constitution makes Irish the official national language. It takes precedence over English in the event of constitutional interpretive difficulties over the Constitution. English is, of course, in full use throughout Irish life and is recognized as an official language. Now, if Irish is to retain some dignified status in the event of a United Ireland, something similar has to be done for Ulster Scots. But it doesn't need to be island-wide, because there is not an Ulster Scots speaking, really, as the name suggests, outside the Ulster area. Now, the scope of its further development would have to be up to the local population and local demand. There are historic traditions of Irish nationalists being contemptuous of Ulster Scots, regarding it merely as a dialect of English and not one worth supporting. So I'm merely here highlighting that if you're going to give dignity and respect to each culture's respective traditions, there would have to be something significant done for Ulster Scots. Let me shift now to the health services. This is a very interesting question. If you look at longevity, it is much better to live in the Republic of Ireland than Northern Ireland. If you wanted to survive the COVID pandemic, it was much better to live in the Republic of Ireland than in Northern Ireland. If you look at a whole range of health outcomes, the Republic outperforms the North. One question might be, does it outperform the North now just simply because it's richer, irrespective of the nature of the health service? Here's where symbolism matters. There's no question that the most remarkable accomplishment of post-war Labour governments was the creation of the National Health Service. And it is understood symbolically to mean healthcare free at the point of need. no payment to see a doctor, no payment for surgery, and so on. And that's deeply entrenched in northern attitudes and indeed in southern admiration of the NHS. Now, the problem is the NHS is the only system of its kind, major kind, in Western Europe. Everywhere else in Western Europe operates with a universal health insurance system. It's obligatory to pay for health insurance, and they vary in the scope of public insurance and private insurance models. The Republic has embarked a long time ago on an insurance model. And what Northerners see is that Southerners pay 50 euros, 60 euros to see the doctor. What Southerners don't see, and what Northerners often don't emphasize, is that healthcare in Northern Ireland is the right to join a queue. It's not necessarily the right to get access at the point of need. And there's a political matter here. Conservatives in the UK, like conservatives in the United States, don't like socialized medicine. So what we see periodically in British politics since 1945, 1950, is that under conservative governments, the NHS doesn't grow in resources to match demand. Under Labour governments, it does. So the NHS operates on a feast and famine model. By contrast, insurance systems generally, because they oblige the individual to set aside some of their income for their own healthcare, often a function of income, they don't suffer from the feast and famine model as such. So I think what we see is a strong preference for the principle of socialized medicine in both parts of Ireland, without at the same time a public recognition that the North is subject to a feast and famine model that doesn't perform as well as the Southern model. I hope that's clear.
Doctor, I have a question with regard to the issue of devolution versus unification. With the Constitutional Convention in this country, as an accommodation, as a compromise with the smaller former colonies, the smaller states in the South, the solution was to create a bicameral legislature. Would that be a consideration, or could that be a consideration as part of unification, perhaps relying upon the historic provinces, so that Ulster would have perhaps in a Senate or some type of body have some degree of additional leverage?
Good question, John. So two things there. First of all, the Republic of Ireland does have a second chamber, the Senate, which was originally deliberately designed to overrepresent Irish Protestants. It changed its character in the 30s, where parties in effect took control of the second chamber. The original idea had been to have a technocratic second chamber in which experts and people from various walks of civil society life would form a weak second chamber. That has now been replaced with the second chamber largely the place of second-tier politicians. Now, at the moment in the Republic, the Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, appoints 11 people to to the Senate. It's a small Senate of 60 people. And that obviously enables the government of the day to control the Senate. I've argued that in the event of a united Ireland, that power for appointment should be transferred to the president, and the president should be obliged to follow a set of diversity criteria, which would ensure the presence of Ulster Protestants in significant numbers inside a Senate. So point one, there is already a bicameral arrangement. Point two, it could be improved. Now, the question of federalism. I deliberately gave you a simplified model of two possibilities, an integrated Ireland and one in which there's a devolved Northern Ireland. The reason I excluded federation is that no Irish party in the Republic, none, advocate for Irish federation. That wasn't always so. The historic Sinn Féin favoured the thought that you had, namely going back to the 4 historic provinces of Ireland and using those as the potential units of a 4-unit federation. I'm not against federations. I live in one like you. I helped in the design of federations elsewhere in the world, so I have no antipathy to federations, but there is no significant appetite for federation among the southern parties. So I think it's a low likelihood call. I saw Mr. McCready had a question.
I just had a kind of a methodological question, Professor. Are there any longitudinal panel surveys being done in Ireland, or are they all pretty much as needed surveys?
There are panels available in some of the internet polling organizations in Northern Ireland. They have panel data, and they have a problem because they're not as big as the panel data used by US internet polling firms. The result is the following. In the survey work that I have done with my colleague John Gary and others who've done work like us, we follow the strict methodological requirements of stratified probability sampling. And we, in consequence, tap a much greater proportion of those who don't vote in assembly elections or parliamentary elections. We get a lot more of the non-participatory people. By contrast, for obvious reasons, those who participate in internet polling are those who are generally interested in politics. So those internet polling organizations show a much higher level of support for an immediate call for referendums and for a transition to a united Ireland. I say be cautious, don't go with them because those polls are unrepresentative. And for this very important reason, if there are to be referendums, you can expect the turnout to be extraordinarily high. Look at the turnout in the Scottish referendum of 2014. It was, I think, 85%. I would expect it, the dead will vote. People will try to get the dead to vote in the event of an Irish reunification set of referendums. So therefore, it's important either to expand the panel size in some way that it taps the uncommitted, the less engaged. In the US, the way this is done is that the panels are so large, given the scale of the country, that they can build representative samples each time. Whereas in Northern Ireland, there's a habit of focusing on the same groupings. Survey work in Ireland only developed significantly in the 80s and 90s. So it's still in its infancy. Does that satisfy you?
Thank you very much. We have a history in Chicago of the dead voting not only once, but maybe several times.
I suspect that's your Irish and Scots heritage.
This is Randy. I have 2 questions. One is, are the churches taking any kind of active role in trying to influence people and how this would evolve? And the second one is, male versus female in Ireland. Is there a commonality in viewpoints between the ladies and the men in the country, or is there a diversion?
Both good questions. Historically, I would say the churches have, broadly speaking, followed their flocks for fear of getting out of touch with them. So many people have used terms Catholic and Protestant because they're the locally used terms. But you should broadly, in my view, understand Catholic to be decoded as descended from the original Gaelic-speaking population and the Old English, who were Catholics before the 17th century colonial settlements. And you should interpret Protestant to mean of British stock historically. And that makes understanding the conflict over the national status of Northern Ireland much easier to understand. So the Catholic Church, broadly speaking, has empathized with Irish nationalism. The Presbyterian Church in Ireland, the Church of Ireland, and a whole range of other Protestant churches have generally favored the union inside Northern Ireland. Interestingly, most of the Protestant churches in the Republic of Ireland have made their peace with the Republic, and that's particularly true of the Church of Ireland. Both are losing, that there is significant secularization occurring, and that is leading to demands for changes, in particular of school government, North and South. Though the major difference between the North and the South is that in the North, you have selective education by so-called intelligence tests administered at the age of 11, and people are categorized as either bright and suitable for grammar school or not as bright and therefore not suitable for grammar school education. And that leads to all sorts of inequalities. In the Republic, they have a more comprehensive model of education. They've implemented it over the last 30 years. And I think it's part of their economic success story. They have a very, very high level of educational attainment across a whole range of skills and abilities that makes them attractive to foreign and direct investment. Male, females. Among the most astonishing transformations of the last 30 years is the radical liberalization of the Republic. The Republic recently voted in a referendum to install a very liberal abortion law, largely mobilized for and advocated for by educated women. It had earlier implemented a change to the Constitution permitting divorce, and then divorce has been progressively been liberalized. On social liberalism versus moral conservatism, I don't think there are significant differences between men and women, North and South. By and large, the men have gone with change along with women. But that picture of the triumph of social liberalism over moral traditionalism is much stronger in the Republic than in the North. And I think that's partly a reflection of how powerful the Catholic Church had historically been in independent Ireland. So you can interpret that as a partial overthrow of the moral hegemony of the Catholic Church, which it partly did to itself because of its sheer scale of cover-up and involvement in sexual abuse scandals committed by clerics. The other thing I would say is that there is some remarkable features of the Republic of Ireland. At the moment, I believe I'm right in saying it is the only Western European democracy that has no right-wing populist party in its parliament. And there are many reasons for this. Some say it's because Sinn Féin covers populist subjects, but I think Sinn Féin is clearly measurable as a party of the left, centre-left. I think the independents in Ireland, often, some of them, but not all of them, have a right-wing populist flavour. But I think it's partly to do with the dramatic success and transformation of the Republic. And by and large, there has been sufficient redistribution of wealth and opportunity so far not to create left-behind communities that are open to right-wing populist and xenophobic appeals. I'm not saying Ireland's immune to these pressures. It could happen in the future. By contrast, in the North, what we're seeing very slowly is an ethnic transformation of advantage. Historically, Protestants were better off than Catholics in Northern Ireland. They were partly better off because of longer-term advantages, and they were partly better off because of institutionalized discrimination. The latter has gone. And what we're seeing is an interestingly higher level of participation and attainment in education among cultural Catholics than among cultural Protestants in the North. So a lot of the loyalist militia and paramilitaries in loyalist communities look a little like the left behind communities in the United States.
Doctor,
They're obviously more likely to have male representatives.
Doctor, this presentation has been extraordinary. I just have a 1 second question, quick question. About 6 to 8 weeks ago, a security officer in Omaha was assassinated.
I believe he was not killed. You're
I'm
right.
sorry. That's right.
Yeah.
Thank God. With that in mind, what is being, you mentioned the need to be hyper alert to the resurgence of the real IRA and the extremists on the union side. What are the chances of those forces separately, of course, but they're actually cooperating with one another because they want to bring things to a boil? What's the prospect of being able to tamp that down and control that to allow these democratic forces to play out?
Very good question, John. The Good Friday Agreement deliberately created mechanisms for the demobilization of all paramilitary organizations. The most successful demobilization and disbanding was of the Provisional IRA. A small number of Republican dissident organizations. It's a strange name. I don't know why they're called dissidents, which is historically associated with certain types of Protestant, but they're called dissidents. They are very small in number. They are extensively penetrated by the police and kept under surveillance. By contrast, the larger loyalist militia have never thoroughly disbanded. And I believe in a misplaced orientation. British policymakers, with the support of Irish policymakers, have preferred to support loyalist militia indirectly by giving them grant funding to engage in various self-help activities. What this has permitted to flourish is the maintenance of organized gang culture, particularly drug-based organizations. Now, it's my view that that kind of activity, pervasive throughout the Western world, requires careful but sustained policing. And here's the question. The Good Friday Agreement allowed for the transformation of policing. And indeed, that partially occurred. The pattern reforms, as they were called, led to a dramatic transformation. The Royal Ulster Constabulary was replaced by the Police Service of Northern Ireland. The RUC had been 90% Protestant in composition, creating the circumstances where one community was policing another. As a result of a successful quota, the character of the police was transformed by 2011. The proportion of Catholics in the police was up to 30%. Then, unfortunately, the then Conservative Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Owen Paterson, later, I might add, expelled from Parliament for corruption, removed the quota, and the proportion of Catholics in the police has now fallen down to 24%. I believe very strongly that even if Northern Ireland stays in the United Kingdom, or even if it becomes part of the Republic of Ireland, you need balanced policing. Without balanced policing, you're not going to get legitimacy for necessary action against both sets of paramilitaries. If we get the age cohort data on the census, I think it's likely to show 60-40 ratios of cultural Catholics to cultural Protestants among the younger age cohorts. So you will actually face the possibility of Protestants being overrepresented in the police service in the age categories where you precisely expect crime or violent activity. So I think it's imperative on the next Labour government to take action to implement successful police reform. If there's successful police reform and careful coordinated activity by both governments against both sets of militia, I believe they can be kept under control. And it's important for the success of democratic and constitutional change, if it happens, that there be no prospect of a serious loyalist backlash. And the way to do that, in my view, is to prepare, to have adequately prepared police. But it also raises interesting questions for the Republic of Ireland. Historically neutral. Neutral against Britain, some would say, but historically neutral, not a member of NATO. In consequence, and this is a good thing, Ireland has not devoted lots of its resources to health, to defence. It doesn't have a significant navy, it has no air force to speak of, and its armed forces conduct peacekeeping missions, but they're not really capable of doing ordinary defense and security duties. Given the clouds cast by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, given Russian activity off the shores of Ireland, I expect Irish opinion to shift over the next decade, first towards greater participation in European defense, and then later contemplating NATO membership. So it would be wise to invest more in the Irish security sector, just to be capable of doing something if there were to be loyalist violence in the event of a united Ireland. I would hope that making sure the program of unification is one of accommodation would reduce the likelihood of violence, but you can't ever rule it out. I hope that answers your question, John.
It does. Thank you.
Professor O'Leary, I'm wondering what observations or forecasts might you offer regarding any future independent Scotland?
I have, over the last decade, always expected the independence of Scotland to precede Irish unification. And I've always expected that to occur as a result of an SNP victory, a sustained set of victories in the Scottish Parliament, putting pressure on UK governments to have another referendum in Scotland. As you all know, recent events have cast question marks over the internal integrity of the SNP, and it remains to be seen whether the SNP will be able to put its house in order. I do not detect any immediate shift in Scottish opinion back in favour of the Union and against independence. It's quite possible to say, for example, to be tempted by Alex Salmond's party rather than by the SNP. So we'll see how that plays out. What I think is interesting for Scotland is the following. Labour is making it absolutely clear that that it will not make an agreement with the SNP to be in government. If you're a Scottish nationalist, what you precisely want is a Labour government that requires your support. The most recent election results in England and Wales suggested, at least for the time being, that the most likely prospect of Westminster elections in late 2024, early 2025, so no, it has to be late 2024, would be one in which Labour was the largest party, and it would require support from the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, and possibly the SNP. If its support depends on the SNP will have a price, namely a referendum. If Labour can govern without the SNP support, it will do so. And the Liberal Democrats in Scotland are as fierce as Labour are in refusing the idea of a second referendum. But in an important sense, this is outrageous. Under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, If there is sufficient support for a referendum, the Secretary of State has to call one in Northern Ireland and has to call it every 7 years, provided the conditions, namely levels of support, are present. By contrast, Scotland has to intercede and request Westminster to have a second referendum. As you know, it held the first referendum under conditions in which Scotland was part of the European Union. And the argument was made then that if Scotland leaves the United Kingdom, it will have to apply for membership of the European Union, and therefore it will be outside the EU. 2 years later, the same man holds a referendum, Cameron, that leads to the UK's departure from the European Union, but the UK refused Scotland the right of a second referendum, even though the conditions had radically changed. The argument is that somehow the Scots had pledged themselves forever to a once-in-a-generation referendum. But what is a generation? 2014? Is it 15 years? Is it 25 years? You tell me. But I do think that the UK changed Scotland's membership terms radically by deciding to leave. And because Scotland had no international treaty with another sovereign state, because the Scottish diaspora isn't as powerful as the Irish diaspora, that meant that Scotland's voice in the UK's mode of departure from the European Union wasn't heard in the way that the Irish voice was heard. So all these things are going to be mulled over and deliberated and politicized over the next decade. I'm not a prophet, but I think the question of Scottish independence has not gone away. Support for Scotland joining the European Union would be very extensive in Europe. And because most Scottish law would still have lots of EU characteristics, I don't anticipate any immediate difficulty in the event of a vote for independence in that going through. My real fear is that the refusal of a second referendum in circumstances where it's clear that that's what public opinion wants in Scotland will give a license to some extremists to be violent. And we know that Irish Home Rule denied led to Ireland's insurrection. Likewise, I think denying Scotland a second referendum creates the danger of possible future violence.
Thank you.
I was very long-winded, I'm sorry.
Not at all. Very enlightening. Any other pressing questions or contributions?
Yes, John.
I would take issue with that last statement, just because I have no sense at all that there's nationalistic or nationalist violent prone elements in Scotland. I mean, it's certainly my sense, both from my family that lives there and my visits there, a recent study there, that, you know, that the question of independence is much less emotional than it is in Ireland. And obviously, I think that has to do with, you know, more ethnic solidarity between the countries, as well as, you know, the fact that Scotland has benefited so much from the Union over the last couple of centuries. So, you know, I've, you know, even some of the more extreme nationalist parties in Scotland, which are very tiny, you know, I have seen no evidence of any kind of paramilitary or, you know, of the sort you would see in Northern Ireland. So, you know, I generally agree with your perceptions, but I just doubt that would be a real outcome or something to fear.
Thank you. I hope you're right. I think your empirical description is correct. I don't disagree with you. I just fear, if there is a genuine and authentic call for change of status, and it has clear majority support, if that is consistently denied, that generates serious problems. We saw something like that in Catalonia. The difference is, I think, that the Catalan nationalists jumped the gun, if you'll forgive me for the unfortunate metaphor. They went for an illegal referendum when they didn't have clear evidence of 50% support plus one in the relevant region. And that then led to a catastrophic reaction. So I hope you're right, John. I'm just warning from other examples, and I'm not scolding you here. I wouldn't like the stereotype of the Irish being emotional and the Scots to be rational, to be one that was universally accepted.
Oh, I wasn't contending that. I was simply saying that this issue, there's less emotion around, I would say, ethnic identity and, given the history and the centuries of
Yes.
oppression that the Irish have suffered.
Right. And you're absolutely right to make the distinction that Scotland was a founding partner in the Union in the way that Ireland wasn't. And the relations between Great Britain and Ireland have been colonial in a way that you can't really say the same is true of Scotland since the Act of Union.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any last thoughts?
I have a question. Hi, I'm Sharon. Thank you so much for, I'm just mesmerized. I actually wanted to revisit a question of that nexus between political persuasion, public opinion, and populism. And you had shared your data, rich data, thick data. I wanted to know, what role does misinformation, disinformation, and strategic application of non-traditional media channels play in a reunification?
It's a very good question. Part of the Good Friday Agreement was a set of statements that the right of self-determination applied to the people of Ireland, North and South respectively, implying both units. And that this could take place without, I use the legal, this is the language in the Good Friday Agreement, without external impediment, which I take to be a synonym for without external interference. And that can mean all sorts of things. It can mean British interference, it can mean Russian interference, it can mean American interference. But above all, I think it could mean interference in an information environment in which people can make a rational choice. So I think it will be a fundamental part of British and Irish strategy. I hope that when there is agreement on holding the referendums, that great care will be taken on trying to ensure a protected, clean media space, that everything isn't dominated by Russian bots. How you do that is not my domain of expertise. But I don't want to resign ourselves to a world in which social media are allowed to go rampant. In the US, there's very, very strong protection for freedom of expression through the First Amendment. It is the First Amendment, isn't it? It's not the second. Second is guns. That makes the US much more reluctant to control public disinformation. No such restrictions apply in principle in the UK and Ireland. So I would like to see mechanisms to ensure fair spending levels in future referendums, to ensure public transparency on all forms of communication issued by the parties in future referendums. I'd like to see an impartial referendum commission established in both locations according to their respective constitutional traditions. It is a fundamental problem at the moment because very small voices get over orchestrated in Northern Ireland. There's a man called Jamie Bryson who first erupted on the scene in 2012, complaining when Belfast City Hall changed the rules governing the number of days on which the Union flag would be flown. And using social media, he and others were able to generate wide levels of protest. It led in the town of Carrickfergus, where I grew up for part of my life, to the local headquarters of the Alliance Party being ransacked. So the ability of social media to potentially generate riots quickly is something that should not be forgotten. I can't claim to have recipes, Sharon. I can claim to say that we should not be complacent in these domains, and we should think very carefully about their regulation. A billionaire who appears to be rather good at building electric cars, but not so good at running space programs, has an enormous influence. And we need to think seriously about how democratic communication needs to be structured in such a way that people aren't locked in silos and are not locked into, in effect, propaganda circuits. It is remarkable how much public opinion can change through the presence of diverse information. And that's what, that's the general goal, which I think we need to collectively pursue.
Last chance.
Keeping you from lunch.
That's quite all right. I don't think anyone's hungry. Well, Dr. O'Leary, this has been absolutely outstanding and fascinating and enlightening. And I hope you'll be willing to entertain coming back for another forecast sometime next year, because we'd love to hear from you again. But I just think we got to give him a round of applause. It's been tremendous. We'd like to continue to dialogue with you, and I'll see that we follow up and do that. Otherwise, I want to thank everyone for being here today. I know there's a lot going on today here in Chicago, and lots of conflicts, but your dialogue has been very value added. Gus, thank you for making time to be with us. And Jack Sanders, thanks for everything you do. And so we'll hope to see you all again next month, same time, same station. And until then, be safe. And Professor O'Leary, have a wonderful weekend.
Honey, what's the date next month?
It's June 10th. June 10th. Second Saturdays, 10 o'clock Central Time.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Very great presentation today. Very interesting.
Excellent.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Professor.
I look forward to
Connie.
seeing you in Chicago. Be well.
Bye now.